Well, good morning, all. I welcome you to another of these important conversations that we're having with the Branch family, Dr. Andre and Petrina Branch. And the first four conversations has just been the three of us, those two and me, but we're trying to enlarge this conversation. And so we've invited some of our church folks from First United Methodist Church, Chula Vista, to be a part of this. And so we've got Alan and Chris and Dave and Sarah and myself and Andre and Petrina, who are all going to be a part of this conversation. This is going to last about an hour, so it's a little bit longer, but we hope that it gives not only some information to you, but also gives a sense of the kinds of conversations that you might also enter into in your own life with folks who you live with and work with and play with, and because these are important conversations that we need to be having. So with that being said, welcome, and we're going to turn to the first question. And Alan, I think we're going to go to you. So you had a question, let's ask, and we'll see where this goes.
Hi, my name is Alan Hay. I heard on NPR last week that 30% of people in this country were foreign, at the moment are foreign born. So I was born in Scotland and have lived here for 32 years, but I wasn't educated here. My kids have been educated here. So my question is, what would be your elevator speech, or your short speech, or your talk to help me better educate other foreign-born people about the 400 plus year history of racial issues in the US?
That's a broad one.
You've only got an hour, okay?
Well, you know, the smiles, the comment, you've only got an hour, they make immediately clear the impossibility of creating an elevator speech, what I understand is a 90-second quick talk about 400 years of history. It seems an impossibility to talk about 400 years of history related to anything, let alone the history and struggle and pain of African Americans in this country.
Can I clarify something? The reason I said an elevator speech, this was to have the initial conversation that enables longer conversations to start later. So it's not, it's the, you know, the highlights that says, look, we have to talk more, and here's why.
Mm-hmm. All right. We have to talk more, and here's why.
I guess when we got the question and thought about it, we both, I guess, had the immediate reaction of feeling like we couldn't even begin to come up with an elevator speech. And so I'm kind of repeating what my husband just said, but I almost feel like it'd be disrespectful for me to even try to summarize so much information in such a brief time. But I appreciate the fact that you want to have sort of an opening to a larger conversation. And I don't know exactly what that should be. A lot of it depends probably on who you're talking to and, you know, what their background and mindset is. So another thing that came to mind as we were, at least as I was thinking about this question, was the fact that I find that in this country, we have such a short attention spans that so much information is kind of conveyed in sound bites or tweets, you know? Yeah. And these issues are complex and require study and deeper thought, and to try to summarize things like in an elevator type speech is so difficult. So I really not prepared to give you that short speech, but I appreciate the fact that you're interested in having those conversations, and just urge, all allies to, read as much as you can, to read as much books as you can about these issues, and articles, and some of the other resources that we provided, in order to really come up with what you feel comfortable with in terms of having that opening conversation with somebody, with the idea that you'll have the longer conversations, because that's part of the problem, is that too much has been left to either not discuss, or just to discuss at the surface level, and when people don't go deeper and don't approach this with a historical perspective. I mean, my dad always talked about the importance of history, and these conversations and what we've seen with the protests and George Floyd have completely brought that to reminding me of the importance of that statement. People cannot understand completely the George Floyd situation without understanding the history, where the protests stemming from, and the fact that basically Black people who have had a knee on their neck for 400 years. So I think that's all I really can add to that.
I would just add that in terms of, how did you put it, Alan? We need to talk more, and here's why.
Yes, yes.
The why is there have been 400 years of loss, 400 years of pain, 400 years of struggle, 400 years of a very complex trying to live in a country with people who seem bent on destroying who we are. That's complex. And so we do need to have a longer conversation. And that's why.
Yeah, I appreciated the fact that the comment was made, because you often get this simple answer back that if it wasn't for George Floyd, or this has only started happening in the last couple of years, or this only happened since we had a different president, or that it's getting people somehow to think of the 400 years and not of the 5, 10, 50, It didn't start at Selma. It didn't start with Martin Luther King. It started, 400 years ago, and it's getting people to understand that this is, as you say, a long-term struggle.
Absolutely. It started with white folks bringing Black people to what we now call the United States of America in chains. Forcibly brought here. We didn't come here. This was not immigration. We were forcibly brought and placed into slavery. That's how our history started in this place called America. So I agree with you. There's a lot more to be said, and it didn't start a year ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. It didn't start with a particular president. It started with people believing that they could own other people.
Yep. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and thank you for that answer. And it's, I think some of that is borne out in our conversations that we've already had. I was trying to make a list of all the places we've talked about healthcare and police brutality and the economics and education and politics and redlining. I mean, so many different places. And one of the things that I'm particularly thankful for is that our conversation and many conversations have broadened beyond just police brutality, so that we can begin to understand some of the systemic issues there. And certainly COVID has brought that to our attention in terms of healthcare and health availability of healthcare and for different groups of people. And so a broad conversation. Dave, I wonder if you have a question, you might jump in.
Sure. And I have it written out here, so I'm just going to read it so I don't jump around with it.
Sure.
I realize we all have good and bad people of all races. That part doesn't matter. When I've had conversations with people in reference to racism about persons of color, I often hear the comment, well, they're living up to the expectations, meaning they are doing criminal acts as expected. I'm not sure how to respond to this. I realize this isn't the case, but can't seem to get the point across. And I was wondering how you could respond to that.
Well, our initial response is that this comment is a racist stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
White people enslaved Black people. They burned down our houses, our businesses.
Tulsa, they, let me just jump in. It's just crazy that we as Black people live with this stereotype when all this criminality has happened to us. We were brought here enslaved. Women were raped. We were been lynched. We've had our businesses and homes burned down, like in the Tulsa race riot. And that's just one example. We've had our children, church firebombed, and it was full of Black girls were killed in that bombing in the 60s. We had 9 people gunned down at Mother Emanuel Church.
Yeah, and that was not in the 60s. That was just
a few years ago. And we've seen how police officers have treated people of color. So crime after crime after crime after crime has been imposed upon us, oftentimes without anyone being convicted, even charged. And so we, though, bear the burden of a label of being criminals. That's ridiculous. And that's the product of systematic racism that defines who people are, that dehumanizes Black people and puts Black people in situations that are very difficult. And if criminality and criminal, and the product of that are crimes, but what's the underlying root of that? So let's just put this in perspective. Crime after crime after crime have been committed against Black people, but we have to bear the burden of this label. And that's how I look at it. And the other thing is the criminal justice system is unfair.
Well, it's not only unfair, but
it's discriminatory.
It is discriminatory, and there are research studies and case after case of us seeing discrimination in police departments and in the criminal justice system at large nationwide that results in Black people being arrested, prosecuted, and found guilty of what is purported to be more crime than white people. The reality is, in research studies where poverty has been controlled, access to education, when there is control for access to schools and healthcare, the results are that there is not more crime committed by Black folks than white folks. The research is clear. The what is it called? Stop data.
Oh, the traffic stop data.
The traffic stop data in San Diego is a clear example. Black folks, this research showed, are stopped at a higher rate than white people. And when they are stopped and searched, they are found to have contraband at a lower rate than white people. So the assumption is that these people are doing something illegal and they are stopped. And the reality is, when they are stopped and searched at a higher rate than white folks, they are found to have contraband less of the time.
I think the challenge for us is kind of what Alan was looking for, is that elevator speech to help people understand. And that's the challenge I run up against when I'm having these conversations. I'm trying to come up with, okay, maybe if I say this, they'll understand. But they have that stereotype, like you're saying, of you know, they don't see the 400 years of history. You know, they're looking at one incident, and that's what they focus on. I've been having these conversations with probably 3 or 4 different people in the past few weeks, and my goal is to get them to watch 4 video conversations that have been recorded. But it's hard to get them to that point because they want something in 2 minutes, and they don't want to change their mind about their position, you know, in that short elevator speech we're trying to give them.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to remind them of the phrase that they're using. Your question said they're living up to the expectations. When people expect to see criminality,
Yes.
they will see criminality. That is a part of the problem with the police forces across the nation. They are expecting Black people to be engaged in criminality, and so they look for that. They stop them more often. And you know, let us consider what a self-fulfilling prophecy is. If we expect people to be engaged in criminality, if we expect that they will be arrested at a higher rate than white folks, we create the conditions that will allow what our expectations are to be fulfilled. We see what we want to see.
Yes. You know, Chris, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that Andre stopped at the trial, but if you look at the statistics too, that people of color are disproportionately sentenced differently. You know, where they're oftentimes a minor offense that the white person would get perhaps even probation, the person of color gets a pretty extreme sentence. And
You are absolutely right.
yeah,
there's so many, there's so much, so many problems in the system from all the way across the board. This week in the Washington Post, there's an opinion piece, and the title is "Don't Stop with the Police, Check Racism in the Prosecutor's Office." And basically it just talks about how this person's a public defender, and I think in the DC area. And it just talks about, for example, how prosecutors tries to maximize convictions, how they overcharge people, particularly people of color, hoping that they'll get them to agree to I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, to come to a deal, but the deal, you know, leaves them with a conviction. But the bottom line is there's a lot of discretion in the prosecutor's office about what you charge somebody, what types of sentences that can be imposed. And this person suggesting that there's all kinds of abuse of that that hurts Black people. One sentence here says, prosecutorial bias against people of color has been widely substantiated. A 2013 study found federal prosecutors were nearly twice as likely to bring charges carrying mandatory minimum sentences against Black defendants as against white ones accused of similar conduct. So that's just, one quote from this article. So it's hard to just give you these sort of short answers or about how to answer the people. I
don't think any of us should expect that we could have the soundbite that changes another's mind when we are bombarded with media that tells us Black people are bad, they are criminals, they can't be trusted, they are dangerous. We are bombarded with that by people who have these ideologies. And so they create the television commercials, they create what we see on the nightly news. We are not going to convince someone otherwise with a nice, short statement that changes their minds. I think as people of faith, we should remember too that the struggle that we have is with the hearts of the people with whom we're speaking. So much of the conversation that we're having really needs to go down deep into the hearts of the humans that we're talking to, and they have to be willing to have their hearts changed. Well, I say that because I think as people of faith, you understand that. So much of this is a heart matter. We can spend a lot of time in our heads, but we've got to be willing to say, I might have been wrong about the way that I've been thinking about these issues and these people for so long. I've got to be willing to entertain thinking a different way.
Well, Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're preaching now.
That's right. That's your area. Let me leave that to you.
Wait, no. This is a sermon we need to hear. I'm not saying to stop, but what I will remind our viewers. So Petrina referenced an article in the New York Times, and we'll put a link to that underneath this video, and any of the other articles or anything that we've referred to. We'll put links so that if you want to go look those up, you can and learn more. The traffic stop data is already in one of the links that we had used before. So we just keep this running list of different resources. I think it's about 40 or 45 different resources already. Articles, books, feature films, documentaries. One of those documentaries, and I don't remember which one, but David really goes to, it shows, and I think you've watched it, David, it shows this growth of how film and different media have portrayed young Black men for centuries as a kind of savage character, a figure, and it just builds on this this question that you're asking. And so if folks are really interested in this particular question, that documentary does a tremendous job of showing this systematic sort of labeling, especially of young Black men, as violent kind of savages through the years.
Well, Pastor, was that When They See Us?
I think that's the one. Yes, yes.
When They See Us, yes.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And again, that a link to that documentary will be underneath this video. So, Sarah, do you have a particular question or angle that you would like to direct this conversation?
Sure. Yeah. First, I want to say I really appreciate the switch towards all of this being a matter of the heart. I think on a personal one-to-one level, in my experience talking to other people and in my own experience waking up to these issues, that's when it hits, right? When you realize, you can watch documentaries and you can read, but you don't buy in until you see it in yourself. And I think the first time I saw it in myself.
Uh-oh, she's gone again.
Yeah. We lost your audio there a second.
Is it back?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
I was just saying that the first time that I realized it was a matter of my own heart, it was a painful thing, it was a tough thing, but that's when my growth started. And so I think that was just a really important point. I did want to ask, did it go again?
No, you're there. Good.
Go ahead.
I don't know what's going on with my Zoom. As someone who I think of myself as an ally, I care very deeply about these issues. But I know that sometimes as white people who are trying to be allies, we can sometimes say or do things that are actually harmful or hurtful. Sometimes we can ask questions that are well-intended, but can be hurtful and harmful. And I was just wondering if you had any experience with some of those, or what ways you've seen as we're trying to learn and dig that we could actually maybe do a little more harm, and what things we could be careful of as we continue to have these conversations. That wasn't a question you had before.
No, we hadn't seen that.
So your question is, how do you handle questions that may sound harmful or hurtful?
Or may be harmful or hurtful.
I think most times when people are asking questions, they're coming from a good place in their hearts. If they're asking a question, I think on some level we need to assume that no matter how racist it sounds, no matter how cloaked in stereotype it might be, this human is asking a question honestly, seriously. And so we need to acknowledge that, be honest about how some might respond negatively to questions that seem cloaked in racism or stereotype, but then try to honestly answer the question. And beyond that, I would say, what is the question behind the question? What are you really wanting to get at? And so I would say that now to you, although I didn't hear, I don't see your question as racist or stereotypical. Why is that important to you?
I just, go ahead. Go ahead, you're about to say something.
Please go ahead.
I was just gonna say that obviously it depends on the context, but I think as white people, I just would be mindful of, when you're talking to a Black person, maybe about a situation, to really just sit back and try to remember that, your experience in that situation could be completely different. So for example, when we were talking about different interactions with police, white people and Black people in their lifetimes probably have very, very different experiences with police. So if a Black person is coming to you and saying, this happened and it has to do with police, you have to remember that you can't completely rely on your experience in a situation to evaluate it. So I think that it's just always, as an ally, to just really listen to what the person is saying and try to, understand that it's very possible that you could have completely different experiences in the same situation. And also, I just would say, just do a lot of research. If there's a question or issue that you're concerned about, I would just even put it in Google and see what articles or something pop up, because I think the more information and history and reports that you can bring to a situation, that also prepares you to be able to ask the right questions or broaden your view of a situation.
We need to practice suspending judgment when we are talking with people who are racially, culturally, ethnically different from ourselves. We have to practice suspending judgment so that we can try to hear what the human is saying from their perspective, in their context, with a life that they've lived. So, Sarah, you were going to respond to why is that particular question important to you?
Yeah, in my personal experience, there has been times where I've seen other white people who are working on being vocal, be allies, or who are talking to others about these issues, and there will be a negative response from some in the Black community about the ways it's happening, right? I've heard terms like centering. So having a conversation with a Black person and then making it unintentionally about you, and just different questions that we can ask that are the heart of the question, which you touched on, isn't a heart of empathy or openness. And I think I just, in my own experience, it's been something that I've wanted to more deeply understand for those who are open to doing the work and who are watching these videos and who are learning and who are growing. What are some things that we can make sure to be mindful of? And I think you mentioned too about Googling. I've heard, try to look it up and educate yourself before asking, your Black friend or someone else to educate you for them. Things like that. So just in my personal experience, I've seen it happen, and I've received feedback for myself and watched other people receive feedback just about how it's important to take ownership over it, but not make it your issue at the same time. And I don't know if any of that makes sense, but that's where my question was stemming from.
It does make sense, and I think the root there is, we expect certain reactions from people when we try to help them. We expect that they will immediately be appreciative and welcoming, and take our help when we want to give it the way we want to give it. And again, we need to remember, people may not respond in the way that we think they should, because they're different from us. Their life experiences have been different from ours. And I think, especially with issues of racial reconciliation, white folks need to be ready to hear a tremendous amount of anger and frustration from the very people that they want to help. because there is a lot of anger and frustration there, and white folks need to be willing to hear that, to understand why it's there, and to be ready for the possibility that their help will be rejected outright. Because some Black folks just aren't ready yet to even be in conversation with white people, because the extent of the oppression, the extent of the systemic racism has been so great and so severe. People may not be ready yet to join hands and sing Kumbaya with the people that they perceive to be the perpetrators of the oppression that they're experiencing every single day.
There's no trust. No.
And when that is the case, it seems to me we need to do our good deeds and trust that at some point we will be accepted, embraced, that our help will be received. I think allies initially have to do a whole lot of listening.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you approach people from a stance of wanting to learn, wanting to help, and then say, now you tell me, how can I best help? And I'll do that. You know, short of doing harm to myself, I want to know, how do you think I can best be an ally in this situation?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Chris, do you had a couple questions? Why don't we turn to those?
Okay, sure. But first, I want to commend Andre on Alan's initial question, that he passed that to Petrina very smoothly. And it reminds me, I was having dinner with my grandkids one time, and my 5-year-old granddaughter, out of the blue, said, do you have to brush your teeth in heaven? And of course, I responded immediately, I'm not sure, but I know your grandmother would have the answer. And so, nice move, Andre. So here's my question, and I'll read it just so. Blackout Day, a call to action and a day of solidarity in America, where not one Black person in America spends $1 outside of businesses owned by Black people, according to the movement's official website. And maybe a little background on why I selected this is I wanted to know, does that just widen the rift between Blacks and whites? Because I looked at, you know, what if we had a whiteout day where we just reversed that? Are those things beneficial? Those kinds of events beneficial or not? Thank you.
So blackout days, or days that people suggest that the focus of their spending be on Black businesses, are designed really to just bring attention to the difficulties Black businesses have in this country. At this moment in time, because of COVID-19, a lot of businesses have been devastated and hurt badly by it, but Black businesses have been disproportionately impacted. I saw one study that said it looks like about 440,000 Black businesses will close because of COVID. And one of the reasons why Black businesses have had such a difficult time is just because of the history that we've talked about related to, you know, why Black families tend to have less net worth less wealth than white families. So the bottom line is those events, I think, are positive because they are trying to bring to the attention issues that go along with, or issues about problems in the Black community related to businesses. Because I'm losing my train of thought for a second here.
While you are finding your
Yes.
train of thought,
Yes.
may I add that the last part of what you said, is it Alan?
No, it's Chris.
Chris, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm at the church, so you see FUMCCV admin, but Chris, yeah.
So you said, what if we have a whiteout day?
How would that be perceived?
We have very nearly a whiteout day every day. Because a majority of businesses in this country are owned and operated by white folks. So a blackout day, in my view, rather than widening the divide, will actually help to close the gap between white wealth and Black wealth, so that whites and Blacks will be on a more equitable playing field financially. There is a chasm between white wealth and Black wealth in this country. Blackout days will help to close that gap as opposed to widening it. The perception of some may be that it may be more divisive to say to Black people, patronize Black businesses for one day. That may sound divisive to white folks, but the reality is it raises the attention of Blacks, whites, and everybody else of the significant buying power of Black people if there was complete solidarity. I mean, we have significant buying power in this country, period. If Black people stopped buying, there would be economic collapse. Consider, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott didn't end because white people suddenly realized we've been unfair to Black people, not allowing them to sit wherever they like on the bus. Black people not riding those buses in Alabama crippled that transportation system. It got the attention of white people so that they said, let's let these folks sit wherever they want on the bus because we want these buses running. And a blackout day in this country would get the attention of white people like nothing else, that there is discrimination, even in areas of wealth and business.
Without raising these issues, the status quo just continues.
Yes.
We constantly, historically, have had to bring attention to our issues, whether it's in marches or protests. I mean, if George Floyd's situation hadn't happened with such a graphic videotape, would we be having these conversations? Would any of the things that have happened since have occurred anytime soon? People's attention have to be brought to issues. What happened to George Floyd It's happening day after day after day after day. It's just now that people have seen a videotape of it. I mean, even since George Floyd's situation, we've seen other instances of police misconduct and old cases that would have been completely buried have now been brought to light. The young man in Colorado, who his case, I think was last year, was brought to light when he was approached by police because he was quote unquote suspicious, and he ended up dying. So Blackout Day is just another example of how we have to raise attention to these problems. We have to, let people know that Black businesses are struggling. Part of the reason Black businesses are struggling is because they tend to be smaller businesses. They tend to not have the same access to capital. And programs like PPP haven't helped as much because they tend not to have a lot of employees. PPP focus on paying the salaries for employees. But it also highlights, and this is what everyone needs to know, is that we have to stay on our legislators about, how our money is being spent and how the legislations are affecting different groups of people. We've now seen all kinds of businesses that are connected to the White House, that are connected to the Congress, people who have an influence, people who have power. They all got the tens of millions of dollars of PPP money, but what money is being flowed to small businesses? What money is being flowed to disadvantaged Black businesses? That's the kind of things that these things highlight. Where did that money go from? Where is the legislation that's going to help these small businesses? So it's not divisive to mention it. It's hoping to shed light on a problem. And the last thing I guess I want to say quickly about this is the net worth of Black families being lower stems again back to history. A lot of wealth is made by white families from home ownership. People bought homes years ago, they get that home equity, they use that money to pay for their kids to go to college, they use that money to help their kids buy the next house, they use that money to start businesses. Well, Black people, for the most part, have not been able to benefit from that basic wealth generating activity. Back in the 30s, the federal government with its policies redlined Black communities, which essentially did not allow mortgages and other investments to be made in the Black communities. And there's research now that shows that those communities still are suffering from the redlining that happened back in the 30s. So Black businesses have less ability to endure 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, however long this slowdown is going to be, because there's just less wealth in our community. And a lot of that stems back from policies of the government years back and currently. I bring up a lot of history, but you should know that a lot of what is going on that helps the Black community is also present policy. I want to direct you to an article, or not really an article per se, but I have an article here that talks about how Wells Fargo back in 2012 had to pay $175 million in a race discrimination probe. And in that case, I'll just read you one section. A government investigation found 34,000 instances of Wells Fargo charging African Americans and Hispanics higher fees and rates on mortgages compared to white borrowers with similar credit profiles. In 4,000 cases, minority borrowers were steered into subprime mortgages even though they qualified for cheaper loans. So it's systemic racism just puts us at a disadvantage in so many aspects of life. So if Black businesses are suffering, it's because we have not had the same access to capital. We've been discriminated when we go to the bank to get loans. And that's why every effort to highlight the existence of and the need to patronize Black businesses needs to be celebrated, it needs to be pushed, and it needs to be supported.
You see why I transfer things to Petrina, right? Petrina brings the receipts.
Well, you know,
don't start again.
no, I'm not going to start again, but all this information, when, you know, I don't do a tremendous amount of research for this Zooms, but I read a lot of newspapers and stuff.
5 newspapers a day, every day.
So this information is available for anybody. I mean, if you have any questions about anything in the world about any of these topics we're talking about, it's out there. And I try not to speak without at least trying to do some more research so that, you know, I try to provide information that can be supported by at least somebody's article out there in the world. So I just, you know, want people to know that I try in these conversations to support what I'm saying with research.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So let me just say, we have just about 10 minutes left. So maybe time for one more question. I'm wondering if Alan has his hand up first. So Alan, we're going to you.
So just an intro. I appreciated what you said about you know, the George Floyd cases that has brought people to these discussions. And one of the things, I lead a social justice life group, and we pivoted straight away.
Sorry, a social justice what group?
Life group, which is a small group in the church. Life.
Oh, life. Okay.
Yeah.
We can't understand him either, Andre.
I'm sorry. So we lead this group. I lead this group, and we pivoted straight away to discussions on racial justice. And Michael Mitchell, who is a friend of various people in our church, he's a young black guy, and he has been joining us every week, and we've been having some pretty or very interesting discussions. And out of that also, and from your information, others, there's been vast reading lists have been generated of things to read. So one of the books I'm reading at the moment is How to Be an Anti-Racist. I don't know if you've read that book. It's
Tiffany, what's the author's name?
I'm terrible with authors. It's
okay. Never mind. Go on.
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Anyway, it's
Tiffany Jule. Tiffany Jule has written the book.
My wife is bringing me the book.
How to Be an Anti-Racist.
I'm listening in.
Yeah, it's Ibram Kendi.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Different book.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and it has won a Pulitzer Prize.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, but right at the very beginning, he talks about racist versus anti-racist. And he talks about systemic racism and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the end of the chapter, he says in simple terms, you're either a racist or you're an anti-racist. There's nothing in between. So what's your comment on that?
I understand that comment to mean that we must be actively engaged in rooting out, tearing down racism, or we are colluding with it.
Exactly, and that's his comment. That's what he is talking about, and it's very powerful the way that he goes into this.
Mm-hmm.
Using
I've written down the name, and I'm going to read that book because I haven't read that book.
Yeah, I think it's #1 on the New York Times bestseller list at the moment.
Okay.
So
It's kind of the term silence is violence that we've been hearing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that as allies, or anybody who wants to be an ally, needs to, on a daily basis, you know, address issues of racism that come up in your daily life, whether or not it's the negative comments of people that you're dealing with that you have referred to, that you're trying to get some language to share with them, whether it's on your job or at any schools, or you know, how you vote, it's a daily or continuing life responsibility. And so I haven't read his book, and I don't know exactly, you know, what he says about this, but
he said what I said.
but yeah, but you know, you can't be complicit. You know, when I was reading some information about white privilege, one thing that I read was choosing not to speak up, choosing not to, or white privilege includes white people having the choice of whether or not they're going to speak up or whether or not they're going to act. You know, Black people, for the most part, have less of a choice because, you know, we're having to deal with it. But it's a daily process to educate yourselves and be aware of what is going on in the world that, you know, should be changed, and try to, you know, take action if you're in a position to do that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but Petrina, it reminds me, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Dr. King's letters from the Birmingham jail, right? And to one of the things that's always been important about those letters to me, and to paraphrase Dr. King, that the white preachers who were being silent were as great of an enemy as those who were overtly racist. Right? That it's that there's no middle ground in this. So yeah.
Just reading a few words out of the book. It says, "No one becomes a racist or anti-racist. We can only strive to be one or the other. We can unknowingly strive to be a racist. We can knowingly strive to be an anti-racist. Like fighting an addiction, being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination." Which I thought was very powerful.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
And I think it's true.
Yep.
So we're basically at the end here. Branches, I want to give you the last word before I close out our conversation. Oh, Chris, you want another word?
Yeah, just a real quick one. I just wondered, and we don't have much time, but I just thought it was very interesting. I visited the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, South Africa. And on one of the plaques, I noticed it said, "Humanity was born in Africa. All people ultimately are African." I thought that was really enlightening to me, that we're all brothers and sisters. We should all love each other like brothers and sisters. That's all.
Agree.
Yeah.
That's a good word. Thank you.
I don't know.
Petrina, Andre, any last words that you would share with us? We know there's going to be more conversations down the road, but to close out this conversation.
Well, I am just reminded of how courageous it is for any of us, especially white folks, to engage in this conversation about racial reconciliation, to open themselves to hearing the perspectives of Black people about systemic racism that is destroying us every day. So I just, again, applaud you for your commitment to doing justice.
I just want to echo that. I appreciate that you're involved in these conversations. I appreciate that you're trying to do your part to, you know, move this country forward in a positive way related to racial reconciliation.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Andre and Petrina, for your time today and for all of this time, and for walking with so many folks during this journey, and for Chris and Alan and Sarah and Dave and the work that you are already doing in our congregation, in our community around racial reconciliation. I give thanks, and thank you for being a part of this conversation. And I just remind us as the church that the biblical story, the biblical narrative is one in which God is trying to reconcile humanity to the image of God that humanity was created in.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the need for racial reconciliation, we know that that is part of our task as people of faith, that God's work cannot be done here on earth when there is still racial reconciliation that is needed. And so we continue on in this, and I encourage you to continue reading and listening and having conversations. So thank you for today. I'm going to stop the recording. We'll stay on here, but I'm going to stop the recording. Blessings to you all. Blessings to those who are watching.